Good morning. Just a quick note about the Lenten season and the readings that the church chooses for us. First, through ordinary time, we follow the sequence through the gospel, but in Lent, the church chooses themes that prepare us for the sacred Triduum, for Holy Thursday, Good Friday, and Easter. So we'll be jumping around a little bit. However, since it is the A cycle, we will be taking the readings from the Gospel of Matthew. And every year, the first Sunday of Lent, we choose the temptation of Christ for the first Sunday of Lent. The Old Testament readings, instead of always supporting the gospel, they're going to lead us through salvation history. Now, on this first Sunday of Lent, all the readings support one another. And so let's jump into the gospel, the temptation of Christ in the wilderness. 3 questions we should be asking ourselves. First, why was Jesus led into the desert, into the wilderness by the Spirit of God? Second, what's the significance of the number 40? And third, why these particular temptations? What is the nature of these temptations? So first, any contemporary of Jesus in Israel would have known that to be led into the wilderness, into the desert, would have been reminiscent of the first Exodus. After the Israel had been delivered from Egypt, from Pharaoh, and they were saved by entering into the Red Sea, and they were delivered from Pharaoh's armies. The Spirit of God, after giving them the commandments, led them into the wilderness for a time of purification and testing. And so the number of 40 calls to mind these 2 things: purification and testing. We have other examples in the Old Testament. For example, in Genesis chapter 7 and 8, we have the story of Noah. And we're told there that it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. This certainly tested Noah and his faith, as he is in a wilderness of water, no land in sight. And it was a time of purification when God purified the earth from its debauchery. The second example comes with Moses himself in chapter 24 of Exodus. Moses is led up on Mount Sinai. He goes through 40 days of fasting and prayer in preparation for him to enter into God's presence and to receive the 10 Commandments, a time of purification, testing. The third example comes from 1 Kings chapter 19, where Elijah, fleeing from Jezebel, finds himself in the wilderness fasting in a time of purification and testing, so that he'll be able to do battle with the evil one at the end of these 40 days, but also in preparation for him to be in the presence of God, to hear that quiet voice in the stillness on the side of the mountain. And so it is a period of purification and testing. Why these 3 temptations and not some others? Well, they would have called to mind immediately for those in Jesus' day, and they should call to mind in our life, the 3 temptations that Adam and Eve went through. The first Adam. That's why our second reading is so pertinent today, and our gospel passage, our first reading, is so important today, because it speaks about Adam's fall, the first man, and the second man's success, Jesus Christ, the new Adam. The nature of Adam and Eve's temptation was this. First, Eve saw the fruit that it was good to eat. We call this the disordered passion of pleasure, or the lust of the flesh. The second temptation was this. She saw that it was good to possess. It was attractive to the eyes. It was delightful to the eyes, a pleasure to the eyes. She wanted to possess it. And this is a disordered passion for possessions, or what we call the lust of the eyes. And the third temptation was this. The evil one told her that it would open their eyes, that they would be like gods. This is called the love of life, the pride of life. And this is pride, the desire to be like God. This is the threefold fall of Adam and Eve, our first parents, in which sin came into the world. And they are also the temptations that Jesus faces in the wilderness. First, he says, the evil one says to Jesus, turn these stones into bread. The first question we have to ask ourselves, was Jesus really tempted? I mean, he was God after all. But he was also man. And I think the reason why the gospel tells us that he fasted for 40 days and 40 nights is this. Many people, when they fast, they'll fast from dawn until sunset. And then they'll have a small meal at the end of the day. But we're told in the gospel, Jesus fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, and that he was hungry. Now, is it possible to fast for 40 days? Well, I wouldn't recommend it. Gandhi, at the age of 75, fasted for 21 days. There are records of people surviving starvation, not eating for 40 days and a few days more, but it's not recommended. But he was hungry. He was starving. His body was already feeding on the muscle. He was losing weight. He was hungry. But to use his power to turn stones into bread was a temptation. To use his power in a way that was disordered for himself rather than for us. The disordered desire for pleasure, for satisfaction. And he won this battle. Shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. He quotes sacred scripture. I'm going to jump to the third temptation as the second one. He was led up on a mountaintop and promised all the kingdoms of the earth. Now, could Satan deliver this? Yeah. All the nations have basically bowed the knee. The pagan nations, they were not under God's rule. They did not submit themselves to the true God. And it's for this reason that the Gospel of Matthew tells us that Jesus came into the world to save not only Israel, the 12 tribes, but to save all the nations. This is the purpose that Jesus came into the world, to bring all souls back to God. And the evil one, the prince of the world, was offering him this with one small caveat. All you have to do is bow down to me. Worship me. That's all you have to do. You can avoid all the suffering of Calvary. There's no need to lay down your life. I will give you the kingdoms of the earth. You will have them back again. Just worship me. And Jesus quotes a passage that fits within the 10 Commandments. You shall worship the Lord your God. Him alone shall you serve. Jesus overcomes this temptation, this disordered desire to possess the souls of all the world. He overcomes the lust of the eyes. And the third temptation Christ faces. He takes him up to the pinnacle of the temple and tells him to jump off. What kind of a temptation is this? This is the temptation to prove to us that he is the Son of God. If you're the Son of God, jump from here. And then the evil one quotes scriptures. He quotes Psalm 91 when he says, God will dispatch his angels to care for you, lest you dash your foot against a stone. It's interesting that the evil one quotes this passage. This passage is an exorcism psalm. A psalm that was sung by the rabbis to cast out the evil one. And the evil one is using this very passage to tempt Jesus. And what is the temptation? Basically it is this. Why go through this struggle? Why do this private fasting in the middle of the wilderness? No one cares. Prove that you are the Son of God. Jump off the parapet of the temple in front of all of Israel, and they'll acknowledge you as God. It is the sin of pride. And yet Jesus comes in humility. He comes in humility to win our hearts, to draw us back to the Father, to set us free. Why these three temptations? They're the temptations that Adam and Eve faced, and they're also the root of all the deadly sins. The lust of the flesh is the root of the three sins of lust, gluttony, and sloth. The three sins associated with pleasure, disordered desire for pleasure. The second temptation, the lust of the eyes, is the root of the sin of greed, the desire to possess, to take what is not ours, to not be satisfied with what we have. And the third temptation, the pride of life, the disordered desire for love of self, the desire for pride. And this is the root of pride itself, thinking that we are God. And the second sin of anger, wondering why not everyone is like me and treats me better than I deserve because I am God in my own eyes. And the disorder of envy, the sin of envy. Now, on Ash Wednesday, we were given the three remedies for these three sins, these three root sins. And those three remedies are simply this: prayer, fasting, and giving alms. Prayer obliviates pride, destroys pride. We fall on our knees. We recognize that God is God and I am a creature. I am dust. He breathes every breath into me. I depend on him. I need him. It sets right our relationship with God and the world around us and overcomes the sins of pride, anger, and envy. Fasting overcomes the sins, the distorted pleasure, the distorted desire for pleasure. In fasting, we mortify the body. We kill those desires by doing without. And so we fast. A difficult remedy, but a remedy nonetheless. They overcome the sins of lust, gluttony, and sloth. See, we can fast also from rest, from being slothful. Not that you shouldn't get a good night's sleep, but we are called to the mission of Christ. We are called to service. And so we fast during this season. And the third remedy, the remedy for greed, the disordered desire for possessions, the lust of the eyes, is almsgiving. Now, almsgiving goes above and beyond our tithe. Jesus is saying, just let it go. Let it go. And you will overcome the sin of greed. That is why this year our theme for Lent is resist becoming unraveled. Pray, fast, and give alms. And as a Lenten memento, as you're leaving the church today, you'll be given an empty spool, a spool that has become unraveled. It lacks the color of the thread, the flesh on its bones. And so take one of those and remind yourselves that it's through prayer, fasting, and almsgiving that we resist becoming unraveled. On this first Sunday of Lent, as we reflect on the temptations of Christ, we also reflect on the remedy for these sins. This is a season, these 40 days for purification, as we do spiritual battle. And on this first Sunday of Lent, we already see the shadow of the cross before us. Because we hear that the evil leaves Jesus alone. He'll tempt him along the way, like through his best friend Peter, to not go to Jerusalem and be crucified. But Jesus obliterates this threefold temptation on the cross. Think about it for a minute. Meditate on this week. The cross of Christ. Jesus overcomes the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. How does he do this on the cross? The lust of the flesh, the disordered desire for pleasure. On the cross, Jesus is void of any sense of pleasure as he experiences the agony of the cross and he embraces it. He embraces it. The lust of the eye, the disordered desire for possessions. Jesus on the cross leaves everything behind. Even his clothes are stripped from his body as he is nailed to that cross. And from the cross, he gives away his last possession of all, his beloved mother Mary. As he says to the beloved disciple, "Behold your mother," and says to his mother, "Behold your son," he leaves this world with nothing and obliterates the sin of the lust of the eyes. And finally, the pride of life. It is on the cross that we'll hear the evil one's words on the lips of those who mock him and stand at the foot of the cross. "So if you're the Son of God, prove it to us. Come down from the cross." And he could have done this. He could have proven it. But he obliterates pride. He crucifies pride on the cross with the humility of his crucifixion. He comes in humility to bring God's people back. And so let us resist becoming unraveled this Lent. Let us do battle with the same temptations that Christ faced: the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, with prayer, fasting, and giving alms.